The Chicago Bears are looking to get Caleb Williams and the offense rolling against an injured Los Angeles Rams defense. But those Rams have been the comeback kings so far this season. And a great matchup coming up this week between two 1-2 football teams. We'll get into all of it today on our Crossover Thursday Bears-Rams podcast.
You are Locked On NFL Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome into this Crossover Thursday, Locked On Bears, Locked On Rams. I am Lauren Cox, host of the Locked On Bears podcast, along with Travis Rogers, one of the co-hosts of Locked On Rams here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day, no matter who your team is. And it's fun every week to get together with our hosts across the Locked On Podcast Network to preview Sunday's matchup, this time between the Bears and the Rams. Today's Crossover Thursday is presented by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use our promo code LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Travis, I think the storylines with this Rams team with the injuries are pretty obvious. If anybody's paying any attention to the Rams, we know all the receivers and key defensive players out on injured reserve. Like, I imagine that's the storyline every week, but is there like another layer here that you're looking for heading into this Bears game specifically?
Well, I think the next layer is what you're talking about, Lauren, which is the injuries that they've dealt with. They got a stay of execution last week. Right. We all know what 0-3 looks like in the NFL, that, in the last 30 years, 3 teams have made the playoffs after starting 0-3. It just doesn't happen. If you start 0-3, that's basically a wrap. The 49ers are the absolute kryptonite for the Rams over the last 6 or 7 years. They've really struggled with them. And they found a way to win a game that they probably should not have won. And they did it without Puka Nacua. They did it without Cooper Kupp. They did it without 2 starting offensive linemen. They did it without their starting safety. They did it without one of their starting corners. I mean, they were incredibly shorthanded. As banged up as San Francisco was with McCaffrey and with Kittle and Debo and the rest of them, the Rams were in far worse shape. So while they were able to do it last week, I think coming into this game against the Bears, it's the exact same questions. Can you find a way to make do with a really good quarterback in Matthew Stafford, a really good running back in Kyren Williams, and then figure it out after that? Because that's what they did last week, especially in the wide receiver game. Tutu Atwell had the best game of his Rams career last week. It took him 5 years to have that game, but he finally had it. And so the question that I have, like, it's still an injury question. It's, can Tutu step into that void again? He did it last week, but he's going to have to do it again because they're still as shorthanded as ever.
Yeah, I think a lot of Bears fans coming to this matchup see, you see the numbers and you see, okay, the Rams are, I think, 32nd in points allowed and 31st in yards, or back and forth there. Like, how did they beat the 49ers? Like, how did they pull off? I think they were down 21-7 in that game. And I know week 1 against the Lions, they were down like 17-3 and came back in both of them. How have they manufactured that?
Yeah, the San Francisco game, they had to get a little bit of help of San Francisco. Now they took advantage of it. What happened was the Rams made a series of really good special teams plays. They got a big punt return, which really never happens and really doesn't happen with the Rams. Moody for the 49ers missed a kick that I think probably more often than not he's going to make. They hit a big play down the field to Tutu Atwell, something that doesn't. They caught a series of unlikely events, all of them in a row. So they had a very slim door, and they were able to slide through it along the way. They've got problems, and all of it is predicated kind of what we're talking about before, which is their health. I think they're really talented. The offense is not the problem, I think, with this team, even as shorthanded as they are, because, the thing that we talk about a lot on Locked On Rams is the CQI, which is the coach quarterback injury index, right? They've got one of the best coaches in the league. They've got one of the best quarterbacks in the league, but they've been getting absolutely murdered in the injury category. So I still think if you got Stafford and McVay, you're going to score points. You're going to find a way to do that. It's whether or not they can prevent points. And that's something they didn't do in Detroit, something they didn't do against Arizona, and they were able to do for a half against San Francisco to get that first win.
Where do you see the injuries having the biggest impact defensively? Like, I know John Johnson is kind of the big name there, but like, it seems like some of the guys in the front seven are a little bit more of what they were expecting week one. So is it mostly on the back end there, or what's the impact?
I think it's a little bit on the Darius Williams hasn't played this season. He was scheduled to probably be their number one cornerback. They went out and they re-signed him this offseason from Jacksonville. He hasn't been able to play. Tre'Davious White is a player that they signed this offseason. He missed most of last season with kind of high upside. He really hasn't been there. If I'm being perfectly honest, he's been bad so far this year. Not just not as good as you were hoping, but he's been legit. Marvin Harrison torched him. Jawan Jennings torched him. It was a bad couple of weeks for him. But I think what it is more than anything is they're bad. They're bad tacklers so far. They're getting pressure on quarterbacks. They're able to flush these guys out a little bit, but they're not. Purdy had tons of time. Kyler Murray had tons of time. Jared Goff, really, they didn't put a ton of pressure on him. So I know that the Bears have had trouble blocking people. I know that Caleb Williams has taken a ton of sacks so far through the early part of the season. But whether or not, I think that maybe they'll get there. It's whether or not they can get him on the ground. They really have been poor tackling team so far this year.
And what about the rest of the offense around? I mean, you mentioned Stafford and Kyron Williams have been, excellent for them. Receivers are injured, but offensive line, tight end room, like, have they been able to get like average enough play to kind of make up for some of the lack of receivers there, or how would you rate the rest of the supporting cast right now?
So the first game, they got it through reasonably well enough because Stafford was that good. The next game, nothing worked offensively. It just was bad. And then they got it done because Matthew Stafford's that good last week. The tight ends of one of the very few criticisms that I think is a fair criticism of Sean McVay through his first 8 years of this team, they have not figured out a way to get a tight end involved in this offense. They went out and got Colby Parkinson this offseason from Seattle. He really hasn't had much of an impact. I'll give the offensive line, though, some credit. I'm glad you brought that up because they went from they really invested in their offensive line this year. They went out and they re-signed Kevin Dotson to big money. They went out and signed Jonah Jackson as a free agent for big money. They took probably their best offensive lineman from a year ago, Steve Avila, and moved him from left guard to center. They really wanted to build that interior line. Rob Havenstein's been out on the right side forever and ever. He's still doing a good job. But the left tackle spot, Alaric Jackson suspended for the first 2 games of the season, and it created this cascade of events that really kind of sunk them in that second week. So Joe Noteboom comes in there. He gets hurt right away. He's on the IR. Now all of a sudden you got your third left tackle playing, Warren McClendon. He got absolutely murdered by the Arizona. So that was bad. Well, Jackson comes back last week. It kind of settles things down. You're playing a third stringer at center in Bo Limmer, a rookie out of Arkansas, 7th round draft pick, not somebody that you're probably thinking was going to play a lot. Logan Bruss is now your left guard. So you've got a third string center. You've got probably a 2nd and a half string left guard. So where they were supposed to be really good, they're very thin right now because Avila is on the IR. Noteboom is on the IR. Jonah Jackson is on the IR. These are 2 starters in your number 1 depth at both of those positions. So that they haven't gotten killed there, I think, is really impressive. But it is a point of vulnerability because they just aren't whole yet. The 5 guys that you thought were going to played about 2 snaps together before the whole thing came apart.
Boy, when you hear just like that list of like those linemen all on injured reserve, the receivers on injured reserve, like it sounds like very justified excuses for the Rams that make it hard to like excuse other teams being bad. Like the Rams, like, hey, we can still beat the 49ers with that. What's your excuse, Bears? What's your excuse, Colts? I mean, whatever team you're facing.
That's a good point, Lauren. You're right. And this is why I go back. What covers a lot of problems? A really good coach and a really good quarterback. Because you're right. If your coach was mediocre, if your quarterback is mediocre, you've got no chance. You can't play wide receivers 3, 5, and 6 and linemen's 8, 9, and 11 and win football games, and they did. It was deeply, deeply impressive, and they got a challenge ahead of them again this week.
Well, that's the problem for Chicago is they're not sure if their coach is very good, and the quarterback they're hoping is very good. The injuries have been a mixed bag, but we'll get into some of the biggest storylines for the Bears and flip it to the other side of this matchup as we continue our crossover Thursday Locked On Bears, Locked On Rams podcast. Our crossover Thursday podcast today is brought to you by our friends at Gametime. Gametime is the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. Whether it's this Bears-Rams game on Sunday that you want to get to, they always have great deals on your favorite football teams, but also not just all sports, but concerts, comedy shows, theater events, you name it. If there's live entertainment in your town, you can get secondary market tickets on Gametime. I love Gametime because you can see the view from your seat when you're purchasing tickets, so you know exactly what you're getting with your ticket purchase, and you also know exactly how much you're paying because Gametime has all-in pricing, so there aren't any of those added fees thrown on at the end of the checkout process that make your tickets cost way more than you thought they would, and then maybe you change your mind or you go back and pick different seats. It just makes the process that much more of a hassle. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem that code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. All right, continuing our Crossover Thursday Locked On Bears, Locked On Rams podcast. Thanks so much for making Locked On Bears or Locked On Rams your first listen today and hopefully every single day. As we move to the matchup for the home team, the Chicago Bears coming in at 1-2 here, Travis. It's been a mess offensively. It hasn't been the kind of support they wanted to give Caleb Williams. Caleb himself has made some mistakes along the way, although I think generally the concern is less with him and more with everything else. Offensive coordinator, offensive line, running back, running game, even some injuries at receiver have made things much more difficult on him. And so I think they look at this Rams matchup and see 31st, 32nd ranked defense. Maybe this can be the week that the offense gets going, but it's been kind of like fool me once, shame on me, fool me 3 times now. We'll see when this thing actually gets off the rails.
Yeah, Lauren, I was curious because, you know, watching obviously Caleb Williams, very popular out here in Los Angeles with his time at SC. And I watched him play a lot. I thought that this was about the best case scenario you could hope for as a number 1 overall pick, because typically as a number 1 pick, you go to a team that's really lousy. The Bears might not have been great, but they weren't lousy a year ago. You know, they were at least mediocre or slightly below average. There are all sorts of weapons. You also draft Rome Odunze. Why hasn't the offense been better?
Yeah, it feels like a combination of the offensive line underwhelming significantly, and then the offensive coordinator and play calling not necessarily adapting properly to that, and also still kind of figuring out how to best utilize the players on this team. So I think there was a feeling like it wouldn't be a top 5 offensive line by any means, but that it could be a stable enough group up front with the addition of former Rams center Coleman Shelton in the middle, although I don't think he was particularly beloved in Los Angeles by any means. But for the Bears, there was a competition at that spot and hoping to find an upgrade there. And he's been pretty disappointing, I think. But even guys they thought they could count on, like Tevin Jenkins at left guard, has struggled more than they've expected. And they've had a kind of a rotation at right guard at this point with some injuries there as well. And now both your offensive tackles are on the injury report this week with stuff. So that group has not been able to just like get together and form that cohesive unit of just like consistent playing time together where you really learn the guys next to you. And then they haven't always had options for Caleb to get rid of the ball quickly, to have hot routes and open receivers underneath. And on top of it, no running game whatsoever to give you any sort of a 2-dimensional offense. So it's been a lot on Caleb's shoulders, and he's done okay with it, but I don't know how much more you could expect a rookie quarterback to carry.
Yeah, it's funny because when the schedules came out and I saw that the Rams were playing the Bears in week 4, I thought, okay, that's about the perfect scenario, I think, because the Rams have really struggled in Chicago. I don't think they've won in Chicago since the early part of the 2000s. It just has not been a favorable place for them. But we've seen it in the Sean McVay era even. The Rams don't play great in cold weather. Okay, that's not a problem. It's September. It hasn't gotten cold to the point where that's going to be a huge factor. And then Caleb Williams, who I'm a fan of, I think he's going to be a good NFL quarterback. There are very few rookie quarterbacks who look good for the first month or two. So let's get him early. The weather's not a factor. He's inexperienced. And it just feels like, I think for both of these teams, there's an opportunity there because both of them feel vulnerable at this point in the year.
Yeah, I think the problem for the Bears is that we said the exact same thing going into their game last week against the Colts, where it was like, oh, Richardson's struggling and the Colts defense is the worst run defense in football. The Bears are going to get it going this week against the Indianapolis Colts, and they're constipated on offense for 3.5 quarters and throw the ball 50+ times against the league's worst rushing defense. So it's like, even when the matchup is handed to you on a silver platter, the Bears haven't been able to take advantage. And so it's hard to come into this Rams game even with them at 1-2, even with them with as many injuries as they've had, to feel super confident that like this is going to be the week that they figure it out. Like the Bears defense has been fine all season. That's not a concern whatsoever, but the offense just can't get all the pieces that they've added here to all fit together nicely into what's going to be a cohesive group. And you just hope that you don't sacrifice any of Caleb Williams' development along the way while you wait for the rest of the offense to kind of figure its stuff out.
So you mentioned that the defense has been good all season long for Chicago. Where are the opportunities for the Rams? You know, is it in the passing game? Is it to try to grind it out like they did against the 49ers a week ago? Where if there are some vulnerabilities, where do they try to exploit that?
Yeah, I think we've seen the Bears struggle surprisingly with the running game and particularly north-south running, like get downhill, get upfield against them. I think when we saw the Texans try and run a lot more of that outside zone, kind of flow into the sidelines with Joe Mixon, the Bears have enough speed at linebacker and on the back end and even along the defensive line to flow nicely down the line of scrimmage and collapse on those plays. You're not really going to get the edges on them a ton, but it was Jonathan Taylor, the Colts, up the middle quite a bit last week. And even in week 1, Tony Pollard and the Titans, run more of those gap scheme runs, pull a guard, get it right up the middle, and you can overpower the Bears a little bit more at the point of attack and get the ground game going. Certainly, I think on the back end in the secondary, they will give up some big plays. This is not a complete, shut down everything you're going to do in the passing game. The Bears defense prides itself on when you make that mistake, they're going to get that turnover. I mean, if you're inaccurate, if you put a ball up for grabs, they're going to take advantage of that every time. And if Stafford can just take care of the ball and then hit a couple of those deep shots when it's there, work the running game and some play action, like you don't have to be over the top aggressive against this Bears defense. Just take what they give you for a while and don't make the sort of obvious or easy mistake. And you can move the ball fairly well against them. With like you said, a good quarterback and a good coach is so important for that in this scheme.
This is where the Sean McVay, like I always picture the cartoon, the devil on one shoulder, the angel on the other, because Sean McVay wants to push the ball. He wants to take shots. He wants to put in Matthew Stafford's hand. And I understand why. Stafford is a special player, but one of the reasons that, when you and I were talking about a second ago, and my everydayers will certainly recognize this, is when Sean McVay commits to the run game, Rams are really tough because it allows Matthew Stafford to be at the best version of himself, because you have to defend even when the Rams, they're not running it for 200 yards a game. They're not the Baltimore Ravens. They're not doing that. But just the threat of Kyren Williams, I think, touched it 22 times last year. The threat of him pounding that, and especially those A gap, B gap runs that we're talking about, that changes everything from Stafford. But the bugaboo for McVay has always been, if you get started in the run game and it's not working, he's real quick to say, okay, let's just chuck it. Let's take some chances. And what you're telling me, that's not the best plan against that defense.
See, that's good to know, because like Bears offensive coordinator Shane Waldron, obviously a former assistant under Sean McVay, and he does the same thing. And that's got to be right where it comes from. When the running game's not going early, let's get out of it. Let's move on here. And I think the Bears have yet to really get that going, and they're hoping that one of these weeks their offensive line can settle in and get a ground game going, so they don't have to abandon it. They're using DeAndre Swift less and less now in this offense because he's been particularly bad. We're going to see a lot more of Roshan Johnson, their 4th round pick last year, being a little bit more of the physical runner between the tackles. So they're changing some things up and hoping for a little bit of a different result this week. We'll go through what we might expect for these results. We'll give our predictions and what we need to see these teams do to get a victory on Sunday as we continue our crossover Thursday Locked On Bears, Locked On Rams podcast. Our crossover Locked On Bears, Locked On Rams is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. And right now on FanDuel, you can start the season with a big return, because they'll get you started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. So you can bet $5 on anything on FanDuel, whether it's this Bears-Rams matchup where the Bears are 2.5-point favorites at home against the spread. The money line is Bears -156, and the over-under expecting a low-scoring game here of just 40.5 total points. You can also bet on baseball season rounding into the playoffs, the WNBA, college football, and so much more, all in the FanDuel app that's safe, secure, and super easy to download. So to get your $200 in bonus bets guaranteed, no matter what, just place your $5 bet at FanDuel.com. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, welcome into our crossover Thursday. Locked on Bears, Locked on Rams. Lauren Cox from Locked on Bears, Travis Rogers from Locked on Rams, breaking down this Bears-Rams Sunday matchup. Today's crossover podcast again is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play 5. Travis, when you look at the Rams coming into this matchup, what are the biggest things they need to do to win this game?
I think that right at the top of the list, and it's something that we touched on briefly, Lauren, at the beginning, is they're going to have to get another performance like they did in the third unit, right? The offense and defense are kind of be what they're going to be. Can they continue to be really good in special teams? And Rams fans will know we haven't talked about that in a few seasons. That last year in particular was brutal in the special teams. They were the worst in the league. They were missing PATs. They couldn't kick a field goal beyond 40 yards. Their punt game was not particularly good. They had no return game to speak of in the punt return. They had huge plays in all three of those respects. They got a punt down inside the 10-yard line when they had to have it. They got a big return when they had to have it. Josh Carty hasn't missed a PAT. Josh Carty hasn't missed a field goal attempt this year as a rookie. That's pretty darn good. So I think Matthew Stafford is going to give you a chance to be around the game. It's very unlikely that I think you're going to see a repeat of what happened in Arizona, where halfway through the second quarter, it's just like, this thing's a wrap. It's not going to happen. Hang around. Give your special teams a chance to maybe steal one at the end, get them in position. I think that if the Rams play well in the third phase of the game, they got a pretty good chance.
I will say the Bears have done pretty well on special teams this year. I don't know where you'd rank them, top 15, top 10 or whatever, but
Yeah.
like they love the rookie punter. Tory Taylor has done a great job of flipping fields and not giving a lot of big opportunities for returns on punts. And they've been pretty effective in the coverage units, not missing too many tackles there. So if they can break one free, that can definitely be a big difference. Although, week 1, the Bears got a blocked punt for a touchdown that flipped the game for them too, as well. So who can find the advantage on that side of the ball will be a big factor. Anything else jump out at you besides special teams here for the Rams to go to victory?
Yeah, it's football 101, right? Don't turn it over. The Rams have only turned the ball over once this season. That's pretty darn good. Matthew Stafford's been really good. They threw one pick. It was in the end zone as a red zone interception. So it was a bad one Sunday Night Football against the Lions, but they have been pretty conservative, or I should say pretty effective when it comes to holding on to that ball. So I stay close, get it near the end, put the ball in Matthew Stafford's hands, and if they win the turnover battle, I think they're going to get to Caleb Williams. That one of the things that, another thing that I think to keep your eye on is Byron Young, who's in his second year on the edge, is a lot better than he was a year ago. And he was pretty good a year ago. Jared Verse, the first round draft pick the Rams have had since Jared Goff, believe it or not, a million years ago. He's been really good. I think that he's been one of those guys that you watch the first 3 weeks, and it's one of those, hey, is he as good as he looks? Because if he's on that trajectory of getting better, by the middle of the end of the season, he could be a real problem for some teams. Knowing what we know, like you mentioned about the Bears offensive line, knowing that Caleb Williams' has a propensity to hold on to the ball maybe a little bit longer than he might, or he probably should. I think if you can get some pressure from both of those edges, that's a big deal for the Rams as well.
Yeah, I think matchup-wise for the Bears in that regard, the bigger issue on the offensive line has been the interior than the outside. Yeah. But that being said, your left tackle Braxton Jones is on injured report with a knee this week. Right tackle Darnell Wright is dealing with a back injury. So whether they play or not, they might not be at 100% either way. And so trying to get things rolling up the middle for the Bears will be a challenge. Whereas I think when the edge pressure comes, it's a little bit easier for Caleb to feel that and get around it. Although, I say that, and he got blindsided by a blindside strip sack last week against the Colts. So if you can get there quickly, he's not going to be ready for it in that regard. Because like you said, he does want to make that play and hold on to the ball, but he's been trying to speed up that time to throw every single week.
Yeah, that's young quarterback stuff. We saw it with Goff here for a long time. It's just one of those, that clock in your head. This is, you might be able to run away from somebody in college football. These guys are pros too, and they close pretty darn fast. So I think that's important for the Rams. What about for your guys? What about for the Bears? What are the keys?
Yeah, it feels like it's kind of been the same thing every week so far. Like, can you get a running game going for the first time all season? It just has not been something they can do consistently on the ground. And then if you get the ground game going, can you open up things in pass protection a little bit more? Can that make the job of the offensive line easier to run play action and have defensive linemen have to kind of respect the run before, on their way to the quarterback, if they're going to be able to pin their ears back and go get them, that becomes a lot more of a challenge for them to hold up and for Caleb and this offense to open things up. Because I think this Bears defense is going to do good enough. They're not going to shut down the Rams and Stafford entirely, but this is a good enough defense that if your offense can play average, you can win football games like this. It's just been that struggle to get things going enough offensively to even be close to average to win games. So, it's about being able to run the football and not be so one-dimensional. So you don't have to ask Caleb to throw 50 plus times and get 300 plus yards, which is great, but not when you still lose the football game.
Yeah, well, if the key is to run the football, I think you might have an opportunity, because that's something the Rams have struggled with. James Conner had a big day against them. We saw it. Jahmyr Gibbs and Montgomery in the opener with the Lions had a pretty good day against them. And like I mentioned at the top, the Rams tackling through the first 3 weeks has not been particularly strong. And if that's what they come at them with, I'm really interested to see how the Rams respond.
Yeah, we said the same thing against the Colts last week, and it was fourth. The Bears had 1st and goal, ran it 4 times, didn't get in, including a 4th and 1 where they ran a speed option out of the pistol where Caleb pitched it to DeAndre Swift, and they lost like 13 yards, and 4 offensive linemen were on the ground looking back at defensive players that blew by them. Like it's as disastrous of a run game as you could possibly get. And I think that's why I'm surprised that the Bears are 2.5-point favorites at home on FanDuel Sportsbook. Like, I don't expect the Bears to win this game. I mean, as we get into predictions here, like I'm surprised that they're then the favorites even at home. Like, I just don't have enough faith in this team to figure it out all of a sudden, even though I know the Rams are hurt and I know they're 1-2 and I know they've had some bad games, but like, they did find a way to beat the San Francisco 49ers. Like, good teams find a way to win games, and the Bears have done a better job of finding ways to lose games than win them.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. The Rams are favored on the road feels weird. That just, feels like a lot with dealing with what they're dealing with. But I think it goes back to what we've both been talking about. They have a good quarterback. They have a good coach. That always gives you a really good chance. So I would be surprised if this was more than a 7-point game either way. The Rams, they have a very early bye this year. They have a bye in week 6. So they need to get through this. They got Green Bay the week after that, back at SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles. So if they can somehow, some way get to the break at 2-3 with the injuries that they've had, and they've had a pretty tough schedule through the early part of the season, get that extra week, get guys a little bit healthier, start to get some of your players back, because the middle chunk of their schedule is not easy. And so they have to get at least near 500 going into that break. And I think they got a much better chance of winning this one than they do a week from now with Green Bay coming to town. So I think whatever Sean McVay has, he's going to go to on Sunday.
All right, let's go into a score prediction here, Travis. I find myself certainly not taking the Bears straight up here. And I agree. I don't think it's going to be like, a blowout in one direction or the other. But I do think the Bears defense will hold the Rams to some field goals when they wanted touchdowns, but enough of those add up to win the game. Whereas I think the Bears may have a turnover or two that puts the defense in a bad spot and keeps them from scoring. So I'm going to say Rams 23, Bears 16. And it's kind of an ugly field goal fest a lot of ways. And maybe it's 23-9 for a while, and then the Bears get a touchdown late to make it a 1-score game. But again, kind of feels a little bit too little too late, but makes the final score feel like a closer football game and maybe reflect a little bit more of where the two teams stand. I don't know. What are you thinking?
Yeah, it's funny. I think 23 wins the game too. I think that is, but I think it's a little bit closer than that. I think it's probably a 23-20, a 23-21. I think it's probably one of those that's very, very tight. If I'm gambling on this game, I'm running the opposite direction. This is not one that I feel great about either way. I'm staying away from this one, but I think Sean McVay is a much better coach than Matt Eberflus, so I will give him the advantage there. Give me the Stafford experience advantage over Caleb Williams. I'll lean Rams on this, but I would not be surprised by any result either way.
Well, hopefully 2 volatile teams leads to a volatile fun game and not a volatile, ugly, boring game.
Right,
but
right.
Either way, we'll be back on Locked On Rams and Locked On Bears to break down the results of this game on Monday. So make sure you keep making this your first listen each and every day. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's always fun doing these crossover Thursdays and get to take advantage of our network reach across the league and across the country. So for Travis Rogers from Locked On Rams, I'm Lauren Cox from Locked On Bears, and we will talk to you again tomorrow.